Mr. Rude is very rude. He is very, very rude. He is very, very, very rude. He is worse than very, very, very rude. He is extraordinarily rude. When you meet somebody, you might think that person has a large nose, but you wouldn't say anything to them. Well, Mr. Rude would just blurt it out. Big nose. But he wouldn't stop there. Oh no, Mr. Rude. Big nose. With a nose like that, you could vacuum the floor. Can you imagine saying that to somebody? Well, I hope you can't. And he was the same with everybody. If he saw someone overweight, he would shout out, "Fatty, you're supposed to take the food out of the fridge, not eat the fridge as well." When he was driving along in his car, he would yell rude things to people passing by. Mr. Rude was a horrible man who didn't have a nice thing to say to anyone, and not surprisingly, no one liked him. One day, Mr. Rude met little Miss Tiny, or not so much met as nearly trod on her. "Good morning," said little Miss Tiny. "Look at the size of you. You're extremely small, Mr. Rude squint. You're so tiny I could squash you underneath my thumb." Poor little Miss Tiny burst into tears and ran home. Behind a tree on another side of the lane of Mr. Happy, he had heard everything. The next morning, Mr. Happy outside Mr. Rude's house with a suitcase in his hand. Mr. Happy knocked on Mr. Rude's front door. "Go away!" shouted Mr. Rude. Mr. Happy knocked again. Mr. Rude opened the door. "Can't you read?" said Mr. Rude, pointing to his doormat. Mr. Rude's doormat did not say welcome like everyone else's doormat. Mr. Rude had crossed out welcome, and then in large black letters he had written, "Go away." Mr. Happy smiled broad past Mr. Rude and went into the living room. "Get out!" shouted Mr. Rude. Mr. Happy smiled even larger smile and sat down on the armchair. Mr. Rude exploded. He ranted and raged for half an hour. But Mr. Happy calmly sat through all, smiling inwardly. Eventually, Mr. Rude went into the kitchen to make himself supper without offering anything to Mr. Happy. After the supper, Mr. Rude ranted and raged for 1 full hour. But whatever, Mr. Rude called him Mr. Happy, took notice. Finally, Mr. Rude turned out the lights and went upstairs without offering Mr. Happy a bed for the night. When he came down in the morning, Mr. Happy was still sitting smiling. "Okay, I give in," cried Mr. Rude. "What do you want?" "Breakfast?" would be nice, said Mr. Happy. Please, Mr. Rude made breakfast for him. It was the first time in Mr. Rude's life that he had ever done anything for someone else. In fact, first time he ever had asked anybody what they want. Thank you, said Mr. Happy. Well, when he finished, right then you can go now, demanded Mr. Rude. But Mr. Happy did not budge. Mr. Rude ranted and raged and raged and ranted, but he ended up making lunch for Mr. Happy and supper. He even offered Mr. Happy a bed. Mr. Happy stayed for a night. Slowly, the ranting and raging became less and less. Mr. Rude discovered he had something that he had never known. Manners. When it was time for Mr. Happy to shook his hand and said, "Thank you so much, Mr. Rude. I really enjoyed my stay." Mr. Rude beamed a smile that was very big and wide as Mr. Happy, and found himself saying, "So did I." Mr. Rude was a changed man. "Bert," blinked Mr. Rude. "Well, almost." Thank me. So this is the book, and I tell you all to get it from Amazon. Name is Mr. Rude. Thank you.